Hey everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Geek and Speak, the Geek and Seek podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about green in Commander. How to play it, how to build it, monocolored, green as a main color, all of it. Thanks for joining us today. With me to talk about this is Preston. Preston, how you doing, my guy?
Good. I'm very excited about today's episode. I love me a good green deck. Always really fun to put out some fun big green monsters.
Yeah, we all know that you enjoy yourself some green. Wasn't your first deck green white life gain?
Yep.
And then, hi, today I am your host, Jason. You guys know me. You might be wondering where Morgan is. He decided that he needed a break, so he took his family on vacation. They're hanging out somewhere. I don't know. Can't think of the top of my head where they are. Also, I don't know if Morgan wants me to let anyone know where he is. You know, he might want to be, kept to himself on vacation out there. By the time this comes out, he'll be back, but still. So I'm gonna be hosting this today. We were gonna have Steven join today, but I ended up getting off late at work, so had to start the recording a little bit later, and he couldn't make it, so it's just gonna be Preston and me. But I think that we got a good conversation going. You know, we got some good topics set up. I think we'll have an interesting discussion. Before we get into that, just want to remind everybody that check out our other content. Check out the Upkeep series that we have. Make sure you like, comment, subscribe. Let us know some green decks that you like building. Maybe some of your favorite green cards. Some maybe pet cards that you include in decks that you build that have green in it. Let us know that stuff in the comments. And then if you really want to support the show, go ahead and follow us on Patreon at patreon.com/geekandseek YouTube. All the support helps. We really appreciate all of it. So let's go ahead and jump right into this discussion. Now, Preston, when you're starting to build a green deck, what is kind of the first, like after you decided on the strategy, like your plan, what you want the deck to be about, like where do you start?
So for me, I will typically start with just putting in a couple of the staples I know I'm gonna put in. So, whatever land ramp I'm feeling like, depending on the colors I'm playing, that'll change it a little bit. Um, oh, what's the one green removal spell? The good one.
Beast Within?
Yeah, Beast Within. Obviously, that's an auto include before I even start picking out cards. So, those are some of the first things I typically do. And then, I'll typically just, start off with whatever my theme is for the episode. I'll just find different ways of looking that up on Scryfall is typically how I'll get started with decks.
Any specific like auto include pet cards that like maybe not everyone might think of that you include in a lot of your decks?
For green, I'm probably gonna put in Gaia's Blessing. It's one of my favorite cards of all time. I love that card against mill decks as a good old safe protection, but you know, otherwise, just some of the standard, some of the protection spells, some ramp, all the stuff you want, but that's probably the most out there in regards to cards people might not normally play. For me, is Gaia's Blessing.
Guy's Blessing's a good card. What what would you say if you're building like a mono green deck? What do you think like the most important aspect is for that deck? Like how do you think when a mono green deck comes to the table, how do you think it's going to keep up with all the other colors?
You want to take advantage of the mana ramp and the things that you can do with all that mana. Like that's why you're playing green. It's to have 15 mana on turn 4 and then spells that can actually utilize that mana very well. That is like your core premise for pretty much every green deck.
Yeah, the thing that green does better than any color, as we all know, is ramping, putting lands into play, getting access to a lot of mana really quickly, and then putting all that mana into really big, dumb creatures, or now these days, they're not just dumb creatures, they're really big and just really powerful creatures. Um, so it's definitely good to take advantage of that when you're building a deck that has green. For me, whenever I build a deck, I think of green as that specifically. Green is the only thing, like, first in my mind, it's a ramp color. If I'm just adding green to a deck, that's what I always think of it as. You know, how do I get more lands onto the battlefield? I'm going to add Cultivate. I'm going to add Kodama's Reach. Harrow is a really good one that I like. A card that I think um, should be played in every green deck is Many Partings from the Lord of the Rings set. You know that card, Preston?
Not off the top of my head.
So for one green, it's search your library for a basic land, reveal it, put it into your hand, create a food token.
That is not bad at all.
I can't think off the top of my head what. I'm pretty sure that there's another one mana, like one green mana spell that does that, puts a land into your hand, and then you shuffle. This should
I think there's
immediately
a couple.
this should like immediately replace any of those types of effects. Like if you're searching your library for a basic land and putting it into your hand, like Many Partings should replace any card that does just that, because it's only one mana and then you're also going to create a food token. So there's just that added value off of it, and you're doing something that a card that you had already does. I love this ramp card, and I feel like not a lot of people know about it just because it came from, uh, a Universes Beyond set. It's a common, green has a lot of good ramp already, so why would you look for any other green options? But, this is a good card that I think people should play more.
Yeah, no, I like that card. I missed out on it during when that set was coming out, so thank you for putting me onto it. I'll probably try to throw that in some decks.
It's and it's a common, so it's really cheap, and it has a really cool art. Like especially if you're a Lord of the Rings fan, like it's Sam and Frodo.
I like both versions of it.
What would you say besides ramp is green's like strongest attribute? Would you say that it's probably just like the big creatures that comes with it, or do you
Oh,
think
for
that
sure.
green has? Okay,
Yeah, especially because nowadays it's not like you said, they're not just big anymore. Back in the day, it's just big creatures, big stat lines, maybe +1/+1 counters to change it up a little bit. But yeah, they used to just be big, but now they're big and they triple your mana production, or they draw you 1,000 cards, or they have infect. There's a million different things you can do with the big dumb creatures at this point. So people sometimes pick on green for being boring, but you can do some interesting stuff still.
yeah, or they enter the battlefield and they're at 10/10. And you cascade 4 times. Yeah, crazy stuff like that. A card that as you guys have seen on the show before, I have a Finn the Fangbearer deck. That's my only mono green deck that I've ever built. I really like that deck. It's a lot of fun. Um, and a creature that I run in it is Zapandrel, Hunger Dominus. This is a good example of just like how stupid green is getting with their creatures. I mean, it's unnatural growth on a creature, and then it can make itself indestructible without actually paying mana. Like you just pay life and sacrifice other creatures, and the thing about it too is it puts an indestructible counter on it, and so you can proliferate that. And if you have like the ability to move counters to other things, now you're just making your board indestructible. And I just think that this creature's, I love it. It's so cool.
So going back to the ramp point, what all do you use for ramp? Because me personally, I pretty much mostly do the spells version of ramp in most of my green decks. Some of my decks have the mana dorks, or like those cards that let you play extra lands. Those I use a lot, but in regards to regular mana dorks, I don't typically run them in most of my decks. I don't use a ton of mana rocks outside of like Soul Ring or Signet. So, what about you? How do you typically go with a ramp in your green decks?
You know, if I'm playing a deck that has green in it, like for example, if I'm building like for my Ur Dragon deck, I like to talk about that for this because, you know, it's a 9 mana commander and it's 5 colors. So I need to be able to put my lands onto the battlefield pretty consistently so that I can get the colors that I need. So ramp in there is important. And the main way that I play ramp is burgeoning and exploration. Like if I'm just adding green to a color, like to a deck, excuse me, like burgeoning exploration are some of the first things that I'll put in there because I just want to put as many lands as I can get onto the battlefield. You know, I don't run a ton of lands in my decks. That's something that we've talked about many, many times on this show. We all know this. So for me, whenever I get a land into my hand, I just want it out of my hand. I want it onto the battlefield. And then I played like the classic stuff like, Cultivate, Kodama's Reach, like I was saying. What I also like, I won't necessarily run mana rocks, mana dorks for sure, especially in decks that care about creatures, because now you're getting value off of two things. First of all, it being a creature, and second of all, it generating you mana. But I like artifacts that or enchantments that will search your library for a land and put it onto the battlefield or in your hand. You know, those sort of the animus type cards. Uh, I need to. Oh gosh, I can't. I'm trying to think. It's. There's an enchantment. Maybe you'll know, Preston. It's a aura, and you attach it to a creature. Whenever that creature deals combat damage, you search for a land and put it onto the battlefield.
One with nature.
Yeah, I'll play one with nature. I like those types of effects. And it also allows me to add some variation into my deck building because it can get kind of stale building decks when you put the same cards in for the same purposes. It's like over and over again. It's like, oh, yep, it's not a whole lot different than your other decks. So, it's using different cards that will put lands onto the battlefield. It's not only going to be good in certain strategies, like in enchantment decks, this card is going to be really good. Um, but it also just adds variation to your deck building.
Yeah, no, makes sense. It makes your decks feel more unique, so you're not just playing the same deck 50 times.
Here's something else that green is actually pretty good at. That kind of goes along with ramp, or at least putting lands into your hand, and that's card draw. Green has its own really, really powerful ways of drawing cards. It doesn't have a ton of card draw options, but the ones that it has are pretty powerful. I mean, you just think about cards like Greater Good. We already said that green is putting out really big dumb creatures onto the battlefield. Now you're going to be able to sacrifice those and draw cards that are going to lead you into more really big creatures that you can put onto the battlefield and even more really powerful things to play and do. Um, so while green might not be the best at card draw, it definitely is by no means weak. Would you say, I mean, with cards like Sylvan Library, would you say green is weak in card draw?
No, not at all. I think green is maybe not the most reliable in terms of its card draw options, but when it goes off with its card draw, it's almost unstoppable. Like when a green spell lets you draw cards, it's probably letting you draw a lot of cards. Harmonize for me, I would put in a mono green deck. I'd put it in a Gruul deck or like a green white deck, probably. Since red and white can be kind of hit or miss with their card draw options. I'm a big fan of Toski Bear of Secrets in my decks because you're going to have those big creatures trying to hit people, so you might as well get some card draw off of them. And on obviously stuff like Return of the Wild Speaker, where you're drawing cards equal to a creature's power, or toughness. Sometimes I think a couple of them do that. So those are typically the ones I'll do. Like if it's more of a mono green or paired with the lower colors. Otherwise, I might rely more on the secondary colors if it's like blue or Simic.
So, like, if you're playing a. How often do you build Gruul, would you say?
I don't know if I've ever actually built specifically a Gruul deck. Maybe at some point on Arena,
Okay,
maybe
then,
sometime early on.
um, in like a green white deck, white has some card draw options, but it's not necessarily.
It's not going to compare to greens.
So then, in something like that, what are you really relying on more?
With those ones, Toski is good for green white or green red. You're gonna want to be making a lot of creatures with green white. You're gonna make making big creatures with haste and trample with green red. So you're probably gonna be dealing damage to people. So I'm always a big fan of him. Beast Whisperer, whenever you cast creatures, you're drawing cards. There's a couple effects like that. Really playing to the whole creature side of your deck, which you want to do with green anyways.
So, still talking about card draw. What do you think of Return of the Wild Speaker? Would you say that's how consistent is this card really going to be as a card draw option?
So for me, with Return of the Wild Speaker, you want to play that in a deck that has multiple big creatures. Because if your deck is like, oh, I have my big commander or something, or like you're trying to make one big creature somewhere in your deck, it's very easy for you to go to play this card at 5 mana, and then someone spends 1 mana to path to exile your big creature, and then you draw like one or two cards, or maybe nothing if nothing else is on your board. So it's a good card, but make sure you're not relying on one creature for it to be a worthwhile hit.
Yeah, when I look at the decks that I have, um, where I have green in them, and I didn't pull up a ton, but I pulled up a couple. Um, I have cards like Apex Devastator and Zapandrel and um, in Finn specifically, I have Fanghorn, Tree Shepherd. So, Return of the Wild Speaker in that deck, with that. Oh, sorry, I thought it was toughness. Dang. If it was toughness, oh my gosh, shit. Return of the
I think
Wild
there's some
Speaker.
that are based on toughness.
I think there is too. Oh yeah. Of course, it's from the Lord of the Rings set.
Oh yeah,
It's
Last March of the End.
yeah, Last
Is
March
that
of
it?
the Ents.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I think
I
there might be
think
more, but I remember that one.
like Last March of the Ents might be like the best mass green card draw spell. I honestly like I would just call this card draw. I wouldn't even necessarily call it mass card draw. Just card draw, and then you're paying because really you're paying a certain amount of mana to draw the cards, but then you're paying another amount of mana to put all these creatures onto the battlefield that you just drew. Like
And
that's
it
really
can't be countered,
yeah.
so
That's the
like
thing about
you're not
it.
gonna
So
get
this
blown out.
Last March of the Ants might be the best green card draw spell. I still think that Sylvan Library is probably the best green like card draw option, just because it's going to be the most consistent and it doesn't cost 8 mana.
For
Um,
being specifically card draw, yeah, that's probably the best one.
yeah, I would say Sylvan Library is probably like the best go to green card draw option. Um, so we've kind of talked about some stuff that green is really good at. We talked about ramp and we talked about card draw. Let's talk a little bit about what green doesn't do so well. Um, I think the card draw is pretty sufficient in green as a monocolor. Because like we talked about, you're gonna get a lot of cards. You're gonna have to spend a lot of mana, but you're gonna get a lot of cards. So it evens out at that point. What would you say is green's biggest weakness as a color?
The only thing green as a color is honestly still bad at this point is removal. It hits artifacts and enchantments really well, but creatures specifically really bad at getting rid of them. You have to use fight spells, and they're just not that reliable. You have Beast Within, but that's only one card in the 99. It just has a really hard time if the other players also have good creatures. That's the one thing mono green is still struggling with at this point.
You know, I honestly think that green's removal is its creatures. Like, is its big dumb creatures. Like, how you going to remove somebody's creature? Well, I'm going to hit them with a 20/20, and if they want to die, then they won't block it. But if they want to live, then they'll block it. That's how I'll get rid of their creature. I think that that's really the way that green as a color wants to remove creatures. Um, Something else that you got to keep in mind, I think, is the color pie is important. and that's always in consideration when creating and designing cards. So I think that that's kind of why green doesn't have the best removal as far as creatures specifically, because green, it wants to build up these creatures and it wants to, make them fight each other. That's really how green does it. It spells that cause creatures to fight. So I just think that honestly, green not having the best creature removal, it really is flavorful in my opinion, just because it really fits well in the color pie.
Yeah, no, it's actually a good thing for the health of the game for green to have one thing it's bad at, because it really is good at everything else.
Yeah, I
It might not be
mean,
the best, but it's good at everything else.
I would say another thing that green's kind of lacks is its ability to play at instant speed, reacting to things on the stack. Now there are definitely instances where green can protect itself. There's fogs that are heroic intervention. That's a really good card for protecting your board state. Um, but as far as like instant speed interaction on the stack to protect yourself, you're not really gonna find a green counter spell. Not, I mean, there might be one green card out there that says counter whatever type of spell, but I can't think of it off the top of my head. Um, so playing on the stack, it's not the best at. It doesn't really do that very well. Um, and even cards like Croson Grip, you know, how often are you putting Croson Grip into a deck? Be honest with me.
Yeah, it's kind of out of stock at this point. Like that much mana to remove one artifact or enchantment just doesn't feel that good anymore with how many good ones there are to hit.
Even though you're paying that mana for no one else to be able to interact once it's on the stack, I just don't. I don't play it in a ton of decks myself. So that's another spot where green kind of suffers. And then it doesn't have a ton of flyers. It really is more dealing with creatures on the ground. Think about all the token makers out there for green. I don't know that a lot of them make flyers. I just, the first one that comes to my mind, obviously, Avenger of Zendikar makes 0/1 plants that you then make stronger with Avenger of Zendikar. It's a very green thing to do. Make really like low powered creatures and then make them more powerful.
Yeah, green's answer to flyers is supposed to be reach creatures or spells like oh, what is it? Winds? No, not some kind of storm card is the name. But like it deals damage to flying creatures, but those cards kind of suck. Most reach creatures aren't very good. A board wipe that only hits flyers is so unreliable in most metas.
If you're gonna spend a ton of mana on a board wipe that's only gonna hit flyers, like, why would you even run it? Why would you? It doesn't make any sense. Uh, so you know, those are kind of some of the things that green really lacks in.
It also doesn't exile stuff usually. So like people can get their things back.
Yeah, but I would say that most of the colors besides white don't really exile things. There's definitely exile effects in
Well,
like each
blue
individual.
has counter spells that exile the cards it counters. Red has like damaging board wipes where or damage spells where if this creature dies this turn it gets exiled. And I know black has a couple exile things too. Green just really doesn't.
Yeah, but I just wouldn't say that. I think all of the colors suffer in that except for white. I think that it makes sense that the other colors have some more options, but I don't think that the few options between the other colors that aren't white are enough to say that like green is objectively like way worse than all the other colors at exiling. I think that that is a problem that all the other colors have. Uh, Something I want to clarify. We kind of clarified this earlier when Preston brought up how this like it was good that green didn't add things that it was bad at. When we say something isn't good in a certain color, we mean it just that. Not that we think that it should change or things should be added, but like just that's it. Like green doesn't have the best removal. Green doesn't have the best board wipes. Green doesn't, it has really powerful card draw, but it doesn't have, the most efficient card draw in every situation. It doesn't deal with flyers a whole lot. We're not saying that this should change. We're just saying this is the way that it is. This is what green
It's
lacks
just
at
good
because
to know those things
it
if
can't
you're
be
going to build a
perfect.
green deck. Yeah.
One thing that I wanted to talk to you about. What are some of your favorite like win the game green cards? Like if you're gonna use green as a main color in your deck, what are some of your like your finishers? Like what are some of your favorite ways to just end games in a green deck?
Well, obviously you have all the giant creatures where if you're swinging something with 10 plus power at someone, you can win the game with that. But like I'm a fan of Splendid Reclamation, returning all the lands in your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. If you have two or three landfall triggers on your deck at the moment, you're very likely to win that game at that point when you put 30 lands in there. That's a fun one. Um, some of the planeswalkers, green is one of the better colors to play planeswalkers with because you get stuff like doubling season, so you can get those ults better, like a lot easier than you can in the other colors.
Doubling season is going to be a lot of people's like basis for building green decks. And that means that you're either going to be making a lot of counters making a lot of tokens or putting a lot of counters on things.
Or both.
Dub or both if you want to have a lot of fun. And then you have like the Vorinclex type cards that do a very similar thing. Um, with Vorinclex though, you can like you can increase the number of like poison counters that you're putting on players, for instance.
One I just thought of that people probably wouldn't think up off the top of their head is Rogue's Passage. It's a land, which your green deck wants to have a lot of lands, and you have those big scary creatures, make it unblockable, send it in, there you go. Like it's not one most people would probably think of off the top of their head, but I've won more than a few games using a Rogue's Passage to make somebody unblockable. It's a good land.
Yeah, and with Yavimaya as a card now, that doesn't just have to be a colorless land. That can tap for green if you need it to. Um, you got to make sure you have Yavimaya on the battlefield. But if you're running a deck that has green in it, and you don't play Yavimaya, unless it's mono green, because if you're mono green, then it doesn't really matter either way. Unless you want to guarantee for lands like this, where it will only tap for a colorless mana, if you want to guarantee that it's going to be able to tap for green at some point, then throw Yavimaya in there if it's a mono green deck. But really, you don't need a Yavimaya in a mono green deck. Um, but with that in mind, Rogue's Passage is a good land to have. Um, for me, a card that I like to run on occasion is Kessig Wolf Run. If a deck that I'm building has red and green in it, and it deals with creatures attacking like in any way, shape, or form, being able to give a creature trample, like kind of sneaky in a way, is really really powerful. I've won several games by just turning my board sideways and then people blocking the way they think that they can so that they'll live, and then like giving a creature trample like before damage, and they didn't think about me doing that. So that's a land that I like to.
It'll sit there for a while, just tapping for a colorless mana, not drawing any attention to itself. That is a very good, sneaky little land there.
It's because you can pay just 2 mana, just one red and one green. You're giving the creature +0, so it's not getting any stronger, but you're giving it trample. So if it's already on a really big creature, then you can or even if you just leave up 3 mana or 4 mana and you make it 2 bigger or 1 bigger, that's still going to be good enough with the trample to be worth putting into a deck. Um, so that's a land that I really like to slot in as far as like potential game winners. Like I've won games from Kessig Wolf Run for sure. When you were talking about planeswalkers, I started thinking about Garrick. Specifically Garrick Primal Hunter, because I think that in a green deck, if especially if you're playing with like doubling season, you're gonna have a ton of lands onto the battlefield. So by the time that you get Garrick out and you use his ultimate, you just put an insane amount of power onto the board that unless somebody has a board wipe immediately, no one's going to be able to stop in time to even have a hope of winning the game. Because even if you don't kill everybody, you're going to kill somebody, if not two players. And then it's just you versus one or two other people, and they're at really low life totals, and you're sitting pretty with all these 6/6 creatures. That's a really cool way to win games. Um, I like those types of things. You know, those crater hoof behemoth type of effects where you either put a lot of creatures onto the battlefield that are really strong at one time, or you make all of your creatures that are on the battlefield really strong at one time. Those are always really fun ways to win. And honestly, if you're not having fun when you're playing the game, what's the point? I think green is probably the most fun color to play just because you do that really big, dumb green stompy thing a lot.
Yeah, green is made to be fun. Just the fact that green will enable you to do any strategy you want in the game, basically. Like when you pair it with another color or two, you can make up for green's very few shortcomings. You take advantage of all that ramp, great creatures, like some good card draw. Like green has such few weaknesses that by itself, it's already a very strong color and it can do whatever you want to, like whatever your strategy is. Like it's very good at just doing its own thing. But as soon as you start pairing it with even one other color, it can very quickly do basically whatever you want to do with a strategy. Like there are very few options limited to you if one of your colors is green.
Now, how often have you been building decks and changed how you built the deck because you knew you needed to add green to it?
Well, so lately I've been playing fewer green decks just to, broaden my horizons a little bit. But whenever I do build green decks, like that will typically be the focus of the deck because, it can help keep the budget down. That's a really nice thing by using those cheap like actual in regards to money, ramp spells, and a lot of basics, you can keep the price of your deck down. Even at 5 colors, you can still play very cheap at nowadays with a lot of basics and still have a workable deck that's not too far behind people.
I've never actually thought about that. Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, like back in the day, like trying to build a 5 color deck, you were going to spend a lot of money. You just were. But at this point, there are just so many ways in green to like go get all your basics out, to even get a few non-basic lands. Green has a lot more of those nowadays that are cheap and affordable for people because there are so many. Like there are just so many of the same effects. Most of them can't cost that much money because you can only fit so many in a deck. When there's 200, not all of them are going to cost a whole lot of money. So I really like green's affordability. Like, yes, there are cards that cost a lot of money, like doubling season, but you can build a strong green deck without doubling season. You can build a strong green deck without Yavi Maya. Those cards are nice. I have them in my collection at this point because, I have that money to spend on those kind of cards. But if you don't, like, if you're like a newer player, you're younger, you just don't have that much money to spend, green is probably your best bet for a strong deck that's affordable, and that I will always appreciate.
Yeah, the really good green cards are definitely gonna be more expensive. Yeah, dude, like when cards like the Great Henge exist, it's like this is green being able to do just about everything except remove stuff. The Great Henge probably is the ultimate green card. Um, so when you get into like the really good green cards, yeah, you're gonna pay a lot of money, but that's because they do broken stuff like this. But then you get into the classic green cards that do the really good things that you want to be doing anyway, the nature's lore, the cultivate. One thing that green is good at is recursion, or at least putting cards back into your hand. So like the regrowth type of effects. you know those cards are all $1 or less. So you can build a sizable like deck base on a very low budget. And I didn't think about that. So that was a good point to bring up. Because even green does have some removal options, but they're not good enough to be expensive. So, like even like Beast Within, that's the best option. That's $1. That card is $1. Um,
Song of the Dryads is only $3.
so that's an excellent point. I'm glad that you brought that up. So if you were going to help someone build a green deck, like if you were going to give any advice to viewers out there, what is one thing you would want people to keep in mind when either building a deck that has green, or just like a mono green, or like a green focused deck? What is something that you think that people should keep in mind?
I think a very important thing with green, don't be afraid to try some different stuff out. Like, you know, with other decks, because of the price, it can be kind of hard to say, like, oh, I want to try this card I've never heard of that I randomly stumbled across. But with green, take advantage of the fact that most of your deck is cheap. Try a couple of different things out. Like, you can change up your green decks a lot. So, like, they're not all the same. You know, you can try a couple different ones. Oh, I like this ramp spell more than this one. I think green is the best color to not get sucked in the staples, in my opinion. Like, I feel with the other colors, it's very easy to get sucked into wanting to put all the good staples in. Green, in my opinion, is the best at, like, no, let me try a couple of different things. Let me try this version of the deck. Let me try this one.
I agree with that to an extent. I do think that there are a lot of pet cards that a lot of people will put into their decks in green. Like, I mean, everybody's gonna play Cultivate and Kodama's Reach. There's no way around that. Um, but you can also add green cards that will play other roles in the deck. One thing that we haven't talked about yet is how good green is at recursion. I mentioned it earlier, a second ago, just for a second, but honestly, green has a lot of really good options at recursion. You get the classics like Eternal Witness and Regrowth, like I said earlier. But one of my favorite recursion options is Balagan Recovery, and so that's a mono dual phase card on a land, and I love these types of cards because if I need it early as a land, I'm gonna play it as a land. If I draw it late in the game and maybe I don't need a land, I can look at my graveyard and be like, what's in here that's gonna help me the most. Um, so adding green for ramp is pretty obvious. But this is an effect or something that it does really well. That I think a lot of people could include into their decks. And that you have cards like Crucible of Worlds, where you could play lands out of your graveyard, and now you're kind of getting into, synergizing with graveyard decks and graveyard strategies, because now this is also going to trigger those landfall abilities that you were talking about earlier. Um, so I agree that green does give you a lot more options than just the typical staples that maybe some of the other colors like are just too obvious. Like blues, everyone's gonna play Rhystic Study and Cyclonic Rift. Everyone's gonna play Blasphemous Act. Everyone's gonna play Path to Exile and Swords to Plowshares and Farewell now. Um, so it is nice that green kind of does give you a lot of options because they're so cheap. If green had a ton of options that were absolutely like stupid broken, they would all be too expensive to play. But the fact that a lot of the green cards are going to be inexpensive gives you the ability to add that variety into your deck building.
Yeah, I'm actually glad you brought the graveyard thing up. I wasn't thinking about that myself, but yeah, green is the best color at recurring things from graveyards just generally. Like obviously, black is better at specifically hitting creatures, blue is better at specifically hitting instants and sorceries, white is the best at hitting very specifically small creatures, but green lets you get anything. Green has like 50 different cards that they get a card out of your graveyard and put in your hand, or shuffle your graveyard into your library. Like that's sort of Green's answer to the fact that it's going to get board wiped and removed a lot because of how scary it can get. So take advantage of that fact. Like, it's one of the most interesting thing about green in my opinion. So yeah, I really enjoy that aspect.
So I talked to you, Preston, before we started recording this about the card Blessed Respite. And that's a fog that shuffles your graveyard back into your library. Doing stuff like that, while it's not graveyard recursion, it is essentially the same thing because it is giving you the ability, it is giving you the access to those cards a second time. It doesn't put them into your hand and give you immediate access, but you now have them once again as a resource that you could potentially draw into, or if you're playing those really big, powerful green card draw spells, now you're able to, put a lot of those back into your hand all at one time. So it's almost like you did that, recurred them from your graveyard to your hand. So green is really strong in that aspect too, and I think that that can be a unique ability to add to your decks that not a lot of people would think about. I think everyone kind of just wants to. Well, I can't really speak on that. I only play in our meta. I don't really know what other metas are like. But I just think that outside of the classic reasons to play green, I think that there are some really fun ways to do it. Obviously, we've talked about like ramp. I think one of the coolest green creatures to play is Circle of Dreams Druid. It's Gaia's Cradle on a creature. That's just perfect. I don't know why it took them this long to do that, to be honest with you. It took them a long time to print that. You know Circle of Dreams Druid?
I just had to look it up, but yeah, I remember that one. People were talking about it back when it was first coming out. I haven't seen it as much since then. I'm surprised.
I think when this card first came out, I think it was like $2 or something, and I thought it was gonna get to like $40-50, just because Gaia's Cradle, the actual card, is like, is it $1,000 at this point? I don't know. It's really expensive. Um, because it's a reserve list card, they're not gonna reprint it. So I assumed that when they did this card was gonna skyrocket in price, but it's sitting at like $7. So even cards like this are, while it is a card, a piece of paperboard, $7 is a lot to pay for that. Comparatively, it's not that expensive. I think this is just going to be a shorter episode this week. Preston, you got any final thoughts on anything else you want to add?
We sort of skimmed over it, but also green is good at protecting itself, and it's especially its permanence. That's always very nice. It has those fog effects where you don't take the damage. You give your stuff indestructible and hexproof. That's always fun. That's sort of green's answer as a counterspell to a board wipe, basically. So, that's always fun. But yeah, otherwise, I think green is pretty simple overall, but it has some fun techie stuff you can do to sort of make it a little more interesting. And I think the two of us did a pretty good job showing that today. So I hope people take some of these thoughts and lessons with them the next time they want to go build a green deck.
Yeah, well, I think that we did all right without Morgan on this one, Yeah, green's a really good color to add for either a finisher or just as a utility color. And it's also a really fun color to build around. But thanks so much for watching, guys. Preston, do you have anything outside of Magic to talk about? Anything cool? I mean, Morgan's on vacation. That's pretty cool.
Well, I didn't have that, but I did want to let people know that our next episode will be us talking about the cards from the new Modern Horizons 3 set and its Commander product.
Ooh.
So that'll be fun.
Yeah,
There's some
and
spicy stuff there.
coming out soon, we're going to have a game where we play some of the commanders from Modern Horizons 3, so be on the lookout for that. In the meantime, though, go check out some of our other episodes of Geek and Speak. Check out some of our other episodes of Upkeep. Make sure you, like I said at the beginning, like and subscribe. Leave your comments down below. And thanks so much for watching, everybody. Bye.